You're listening to the Common Fan Podcast, a Husker football podcast for the common fan, by the common fan.
Welcome back to the Common Fan Podcast. I am TJ Burkle with Matty Owens Sr. and Geoff in Lincoln. This is episode 5 of the Reckoning series. Special guest Brandon Vogel is joining us for all of the Reckoning episodes. And our featured guest today is Evan Bland. Evan, Brandon, welcome, gentlemen.
How's it going, guys?
Doing great.
Very well.
Doing well.
Make sure to check out episodes 1 through 4 if you haven't already, Common fans. We've taken an in-depth look at whether Nebraska should have fired Frank Solich, examined the question of whether Bill Callahan might have worked with more time, explored the still divisive Pelini era, and discuss the entirely ill-conceived Mike Riley hire. You can access all the episodes on our new website, www.commonfan.co. Check out the website, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe on YouTube, and see all the ways you can access podcast episodes. The question we're exploring today is, how in the world did Scott Frost not work at Nebraska? Before we get into the meat of this episode, make sure to get your own meat, Common fans, from Certified Piedmontese Beef. Stop by your local Mercado Butcher Shop at 30th and Yankee Hill or 84th and Havelock in Lincoln and at 162nd and Maple in Omaha. The Mercado Butcher Shops have hot, fresh food daily, and they've got all your favorite cuts of steak, ground beef, kebabs, ribs, beef jerky, beef bacon, beef, everything. You can also go to cpbeef.com to get certified Piedmontese products shipped right to your front door anywhere across all 50 states. Make it happen, Common fans. It's grilling season, and soon it will be tailgate season. Certified Piedmontese, powering the Husker football team and powering the Common Fan Podcast. All right, let's dive in. We always start these episodes, Evan, with kind of looking at the outlook for Nebraska football whenever a new coach was hired. So we all know the story as the 2017 Nebraska football season was crumbling before our very eyes. There was hope in Husker Nation. The stars were aligning as Scott Frost's Central Florida team made a magical run to an undefeated season, a conference championship, and of course, New Year's Day Bowl victory over Auburn. Late that season, Frost's UCF team was playing Temple on Saturday, November 18th. The day before the Temple game, athletic director Bill Moose and his wife and Matt Davison meet with Frost and Garrett Lambrecht, who was kind of Frost's longtime right-hand man, chief of staff at both Central Florida and Nebraska, in a hotel near the Philadelphia airport. Moose had some back-channel communication with Frost up to that point, mostly through Davison, but that was the first time they met in person and first time they had any sort of extended conversation. Less than 2 weeks later, Frost would accept the Nebraska job. Frost was the slam dunk hire who would bring Nebraska back to its rightful place atop the college football universe. He was the hottest coach in the country. Florida wanted him. Tennessee wanted him. Everybody wanted him. He came home. He was the guy who would bring balance to the force. Like literally any athletic director would have hired Scott Frost at that point. Evan, what are your recollections of that period around when Frost was hired? Like what stood out to you? What do you recall when you think back on that period?
Well, I just remember you could kind of feel change in real time. I mean, everyone knew at that point that the Mike Riley era was not going to happen. I mean, Iowa trounced Nebraska in the last game of the season, and you just knew it was over. You'd known it was over most of the way, and there had been talk about Scott Frost for months. And at this point, like you mentioned, it had come out that Nebraska had been talking with Scott Frost. It looked like they were on the verge of an agreement, and the imagination, I think, kind of runs wild at that point. You look at what he's doing at UCF, on his way to a 13-0 season. That was a fun team to watch. They scored points. They went up and down the field, and you just thought, man, what would that look like in the Big Ten? What would that look like at Nebraska? He was the guy who people dreamed of merging Husker Power as a former quarterback at Nebraska with Oregon speed, modernizing the Nebraska offense, taking the best of both worlds and bringing it to Lincoln. And you're right. Like, it was a consensus no-brainer of a hire. There were no dissenters really about that at that time. And, more than anything, I think people felt the emotion that Scott was feeling leaving that UCF team. And he made that pretty clear in different interviews down the stretch, was he was trying to enjoy those final moments with those guys while feeling the pull of coming home. Later, we learned that Tom Osborne calls him and encourages him and kind of serves as a sounding board to that end as well. So just a lot going on sort of in front of the nation, like right out there for people to see. So there was a ton of optimism that was going to be the hire. And obviously when it ended up happening, it was just the start of an off-season hype.
Evan, do you remember, or did anything stand out to you about the opening press conference?
Oh yeah, of course. I mean, first of all, there was the now infamous, we're not going to have to adjust to the Big Ten. The Big Ten will adjust to us line, which hung over his head, and I thought served as a kind of a final judgment by the end of his tenure. But the other thing, in hindsight, and in the moment, it was surprising, and in hindsight, I think it was a red flag too. And I found this quote, so I'll read it to you. But he had a 8 or 9 minute side session with media after his actual introductory press conference, and this is one of the first things he said. He said, "I know what I'm getting myself into. I'm going to lose it on every one of you," talking to the media, "if you approach my family. It's already happening. I'm telling you right now, my parents, my wife, my child are off limits. I won't answer another question if that happens." And that's the tone that he set at his introductory press conference, which,
Yikes.
it kind of, I thought in hindsight, especially, and even at the time, it was like, okay, this is somebody who has some baggage at Nebraska, somebody who has been here, somebody who has seen the highs of a national championship and has felt the lows of being benched and the Lawrence Phillips scandal and all the other things that went into it. So I thought that those two things to me really defined that opening presser: the optimism, perhaps the borderline arrogance that he was going to change the Big Ten with what he did and what Nebraska did and what his schemes were. And then just, again, the reminder that, he's been here. He has a sense of maybe what the spotlight can feel like when things aren't going so well. And to set that tone on your what's supposed to be a day of celebration, a honeymoon period. Wow, what a sign in hindsight that ended up being.
I remember that. And I thought in my head, he said that on like the press conference, the main press conference that was like televised or whatever, but maybe it was just reading about it after the fact. But
Right.
Either way, like that's such an, to your point, in retrospect, that's such an odd, like that would make news in almost every other like new high, like that would almost always make news, except that there was so much, and it did. I mean, you guys reported on it, but I think fans were like, whatever, like there's just so much euphoria that we got our guy and we were about to turn things around that it was just sort of like we brushed past it. But
Yeah.
I think, it kind of, in some ways, that sort of attitude shone throughout his tenure. Brandon, do you remember anything about sort of that whole piece of it?
Yeah, I mean the two quotes that Evan mentioned, and thanks Evan for grabbing that second one, because that's the one that really stood out to me. Now, I wasn't at that press conference. I watched it live, and I was coordinating with our staff who was there afterwards. And the big topic was that second quote that Evan mentioned. And I remember kind of taking a deep breath at that moment then, because first of all, fair enough. It's fair enough for a coach to set those boundaries, I think. But it just let you know that, this was like a coronation. It was Nebraska fans and I think the Nebraska program's dream candidate, right? Like after a gradual kind of erosion of Nebraska's standing nationally, here they were going to get the number one candidate in the coaching cycle that year. And of course, it was because of the connection to Nebraska. But that quote where he said that, and with the tone specifically, kind of made me realize, like, well, maybe this is Frost's dream job, but it doesn't feel like it right now. That's understandable. You know, when you look at his time from before the Lawrence Phillips stuff, before the getting benched stuff, like deciding to go to Stanford. Like I remember going back and reading stuff from when he transferred back to Nebraska, like letters to the editor in the Lincoln Journal Star, and people being like, they were not Scott Frost fans because he was the homegrown guy who left to go learn how to play in the West Coast offense. So it was understandable that, you know, his time in Nebraska was not just sunshine and rainbows the whole time. Ended up resulting in Nebraska's last national title, but that was the moment, and it was his first day on the job where I was like, oh, okay, this is a complicated situation, I think, for him specifically.
Don't you guys feel like in that moment or the leading up to Scott Frost getting hired, that was kind of in the back of most Husker fans' mind, but we just kind of pushed it even further back there to not think about how it wasn't all rainbows and roses for Scott Frost and his whole story before he came to Nebraska, then when he came back from Stanford, and the Lawrence Phillips thing and all those things. At least for me, I kind of felt like I'm willing to forget about that because this guy's a hot college football coach right now, and he's one of ours, and he's coming home. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but it felt like we kind of glossed over all, like Evan said, the baggage that he kind of had. But that's really astute observation, Evan, and especially in hindsight.
Well, I think as a fan though too, Matt, I remember, like, it's sort of, I'm not sure if I actively thought this, but it was sort of like all's well that ends well, right? So
right.
he won a national championship, and now he's coming back as the hottest coach in the country, and we will undoubtedly win 10 national championships in the next like 12 years or something like that. So it's all going to be fine. So like whatever else there was, like we're going to forget about this, and we're going to forget about this comment. It doesn't matter because we're going to be so good, and he's going to be the greatest coach in Nebraska history and all that. So it was kind of that feeling of, I remember for me, it wasn't like we're willing to forget about that. It was just all like, well, that's all in the past. And, you know, he left on a high and he's coming back on a high.
He's matured. He's aged. We're all a little older, a little wiser.
And I mean, also, like, I mean, the fans were also culpable in some of that stuff too.
Oh, absolutely.
Back in the day.
Absolutely.
I think both of you guys would agree with me too. And I'm sure maybe Evan and Brandon would too. I mean, at that moment, looking back on it now and seeing how everything played out, it does seem arrogant, some of the things that we were saying, but I won't lie to you. At that exact moment, some of those quotes he was making about the Big Ten adjusting to us, I ate that shit up. Like I was drinking the Kool-Aid immediately, which kind of leads to my question. And when he came here, I think we also need to remember of who we had before and his demeanor and how he handled things. And Scott Frost coming in, being the golden boy that he is, his bravado and what he brought to the table immediately. I'm like, God, he's so much more different than Riley. It's just refreshing. This guy's going to right the ship immediately for Husker football, and I can't wait to watch it unfold. So I had people in the office that were like, we're winning 11 games this year minimum type of thing. Like right off the bat, the usual Husker Kool-Aid drinkers. I'm curious for both Evan and Brandon, what were your more realistic, grounded expectations? Was this going to turn around immediately, did you think? Was this going to take time, or were you not believers? And I want to hear both of your opinions on that.
Well, I thought one thing that really put wind in the sails of the momentum was when they signed Adrian Martinez and they got his commitment, and that was one of the early tentpole recruiting moments for that staff. If you recall, they were doing preparation for the Peach Bowl against Auburn at that time, and they were flying across country and making a visit to Adrian Martinez out there in California, and they get the 4-star commitment who had looks from other top colleges, and suddenly Nebraska had its guy right off the jump, and even then he wasn't crowned the starter right away, but I think people could see where it was going, the kind of style of offense they were going to have. And the other part of the profile of a Scott Frost team was the defensive side was more about taking risks, was about getting takeaways, TFLs to get the ball back to the offense. And so the big question was, okay, what's this Corvette of an offense going to look like at Nebraska? And so when they got Adrian Martinez, I do think there was a lot of excitement in addition to what we saw from Scott Frost just in the press conference, that okay, now they have the trigger man, move forward with this thing. So it did, I think, look pretty optimistic early on. The schedule lined up favorably. Of course, they were supposed to start with Akron, and they had Troy at home and Colorado. And so like it looked like there was this sort of runway where the team could take off. And so, yeah, I mean, I thought a bowl game seemed reasonable. I don't know if I was saying 11 wins or even 8, but like I did think, 6 was on the table because they got that guy. And that was the big question. You could sort of plug and play on the other side, figure things out with some of your skill guys, but you needed a quarterback. And so I thought the fact that they added Adrian Martinez really added some legitimacy to the optimism that they felt in December.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't raising any red flags at that point, personally, and I think one of the things for me was I was one of the Nebraska media members. There were quite a few of us who were down there for the Peach Bowl when UCF beat Auburn, and that was an interesting opportunity to get to talk to a lot of the coaches, and not just coaches, but the UCF players, and a lot of the things that I was hearing, about kind of how they built this and how they did this in 2 years, and some of the, like, I know some people don't like talk about this stuff, but like the culture pieces of it, I was like, okay, yeah, this kind of sounds like stuff that has worked elsewhere. So I think that even like fueled a little bit of maybe what I thought Nebraska's ceiling was, not necessarily right away, because I think I was probably in that, yeah, you get bowl eligible this first year, and which seemed doable with that schedule and with the talent they had back, and to Evan's point, getting the QB right away, that's always key for any new coaching staff. I kind of thought they had a chance to be better right away in 2018, and that was kind of the baseline expectation for me, I think.
For sure.
Well, I mean, guys, it's easy to kind of think about this and say this in retrospect, but at the time when we hired Scott Frost, just about it felt like any athletic director would have hired him. But you consider how things turn out. Should you think there should have been, I don't know, a more formal search? I mean, should there at least have been an interview where Moose said, okay, tell me how you're going to do this at Nebraska. Tell me how you're going to deal with the Big Ten, et cetera. Should it have been maybe something more than like the coronation that took place?
Well, for what it's worth, and I don't have all the names in front of me, but I know that particular coaching cycle was not a good one. Most of those guys that were hired that were hot names, it didn't happen. It didn't stick. So I don't know. And maybe some of those conversations were had, but like, I think you think about Scott Frost's background. I mean, he played for Tom Osborne. He learned under, the West Coast offense under Walsh out in Stanford. He worked with Raheem Morris, Mike Tomlin, I should say, and Bill Belichick too. I mean, Belichick was someone who absolutely endorsed that hire that Nebraska made at that time. So there was this sense that like, this is the expert. This is the guy who's learned under all the greats, who's coming in. And so I don't know that Bill Moose would have said that he was the expert. He was the AD. His job when he came to Nebraska a few months earlier was to make the hires, to be the guy to promote that change. So I don't think Bill Moose maybe had the answers or knew what he was looking for. He was looking for the guy who would have the answers. And I think the resume backed up at that time pretty strongly that Scott Frost could be that guy.
I agree.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think Bill Moose was brought on to do one thing specifically, and that was land Scott Frost. Mm-hmm. And that's what he was good. That's what he was great at. He was kind of a headhunter guy, make a splashy hire. The first time I ever talked to Bill Moose one-on-one, he told me he liked sizzle, which, that's his quote. I think he ended up using with a lot of people. But that kind of told you right there, and Frost needed to be convinced. He needed to believe that Nebraska was a place he could win at. I think that was a big piece of it. And Moose went on and made the Hoiberg hire. It's not the only thing he did at Nebraska, but to answer your question, should Nebraska have engaged in more of a full-fledged search? Yeah, I think so. If this were the NFL, you'd have to interview. additional candidates. And I don't think that's ever a bad idea. But it's just like, if Frost had said no, or if Moose had just not sealed the deal, like if Frost had gone elsewhere, like how would that have gone over? You know, what would have happened if all of a sudden, you know, it was like, okay, well, it looks like Frost's going to Florida, so here's Mike Norvell. Welcome to Lincoln. Which, you know,
Yeah.
Mike Norvell, things are going pretty good for him now, but
Right.
it didn't start out that way at Florida State.
I can tell you what would have happened there, Brandon. Florida would have gone on to win multiple national championships because that's what happens to us.
It's such a good point, Jeff. But like, yeah, we have to acknowledge as the common fans, if Nebraska had even, it's so easy to say now, if it had gotten out that Nebraska even had, if that Bill Moose passed another coach in the street and said hi, like Husker fans would have absolutely lost their minds. Like, what do you mean? Why are we not focusing all of our energy on Scott Frost?
I think that's why we find it so bizarre. Is like, that was the slam dunk. Like that was who we had to get.
Right.
You know, so.
Right. Okay. Looking back at the Frost tenure, they started off 0-6 in his first year in 2018, after just a series of crazy and unpredictable and unfortunate games. Ended the season 4-8 that year. After a lot of offseason hype and expectation that they would turn the corner, they go 5-7 in 2019. 2020 was a COVID season, and they finished 3-5 in that season. 2021, as everyone remembers, we had the greatest 3-9 team in history. And then, of course, in 2022, the team starts off 1-2. That included the infamous onside kick in the loss to Northwestern in Ireland, and of course the 45-42 loss to Georgia Southern at home when the defense could not stop Georgia Southern. The offense actually looked pretty good that night. Frost is fired after the Georgia Southern game. He does not have a winning record in even one season at Nebraska. They do not go to a bowl game. They don't even go 6-6. It's still shocking to me to say those words. And I think just in looking back and preparing for this episode, you know, there's just so many what ifs from the Frost era, right? Like, what if the Akron game never gets canceled? Do they roll to victory and then not lose to Colorado and then not lose to Troy, and maybe at least start off, you know, 3-0, 2-1 that first year, and maybe that kind of propels them to a bowl game? And does that change the trajectory of the entire tenure for Frost, right? And then there's so many individual games where, if, you know, we say, what if just one thing happened differently, right? What if JD Spielman doesn't lose the ball in the sun against Ohio State in 2018? What if they can make one more stop and avoid overtime against Colorado in 2019? What if Frost didn't have to deal with the COVID season? I mean, your pivotal third season, that's, you know, that everybody had to deal with that. As my high school baseball coach always said, it's not 75 and sunny in the other dugout. Like, everybody had to deal with it, right? But still, that was a pretty pivotal season for him to have to deal with a once in a lifetime pandemic situation. I mean, there's the entire 2021 season, the punt return against Michigan State, the fumble against Michigan, the double-digit lead going into the fourth quarter against Iowa. It is painful for me to say these words. Evan, Brandon, what are your biggest what-ifs from the Frost era?
TJ, you covered a good number of them right there. I mean, the one that always comes to mind for me is the first one, though, is the Akron game. And, you know, just how electric the stadium was that night. First the vibe, and then literally with the thunderstorms rolling through. But, you know, the kickoff, I mean, people were amped through the roof for that thing. And then it gets wiped out. It doesn't happen. And so, like, in a parallel universe where there were clear skies that night, say Nebraska beats what was a pretty subpar Akron team, they're ready, they're warmed up, they're ready to go against Colorado. Maybe Adrian Martinez doesn't have his knee twisted in that game, and so he can play in the Troy game. So say they're at worst 2-1, 3-0 at that point. They're probably on their way to a bowl game in that first season. That takes a lot of the pressure off. In subsequent seasons, that would create recruiting momentum, that some of the vision that Scott Frost had laid out was already coming to fruition. And it didn't happen. They were 0-6. They, had to scramble to get to the 4 wins. And yeah, there was some momentum because of the way they finished the season against Iowa. And of course, they were preseason top 25 in 2019, but it just kind of felt hollow because they hadn't shown anything, not really. So I think that's one for me. And then I would say that 21 season as well. I mean, the 2020 season was so bizarre. It kind of felt like a throwaway. A lot of other programs that were traditionally good struggled that year. And I think by 2022, things were too far off the rails. I mean, Trev Alberts told us after the 21 season that there was no empirical evidence to suggest that this would be a success by extending Frost another year, but he was a Husker and they were going to be loyal to him. So to me, that 21 season was the other pivot point in that tenure. And you laid out a lot of the games. The one to me that always comes to mind is Michigan State, where the defense, I don't believe they allowed a first down in the second half. And it came down to a punt going to the wrong part of the field, and it was returned, and they lose. And just the dejection. I mean, I traveled to all the games home and away, and the 2 games to me that I've never seen players more pissed off was the Michigan State game that year and the Colorado game in 2019, when I almost got nailed by a water bottle from Ben Stilley, who was just chucking it off after they lost. So, like it added up. And I think that was kind of the bottom line too. There were all these individual games, but like the cumulative effect that had on the psyche of certainly the fans, but the players, the staff, by 2022, it was too far gone. So those are some of the ones that stand out to me where, man, if you could have nipped that thing a little bit earlier, maybe they could have built something out of it.
Yeah, it's kind of a tough one to assess. Like looking back at it now, especially that 2021 season, like I was like, oh, how did they re-up for another year of this? So appreciate Evan mentioning the no empirical evidence. I forgot about that momentarily. I think the question is like, at what point during the Frost tenure did this team and program, I guess at that point, take on kind of the hard luck persona that I think it's still trying to shake? I mean, I think we've heard Matt Rule talk about it after the 2023 season of you get into these close games, and there just seems to be a sense of like, oh, it's something's like it's gonna go wrong, like it's gonna go bad. And Frost brought that up continually of like, we just got to get one of these and see what happens. It's like, how long does that? I mean, because you can kind of throw out year one. I think you can explain almost anything away in a year one scenario. So does that pop up at some point in 2019? Because just wait, 2021 is going to be an entire season of that. So it's weird thinking like what could have been the inciting incident that maybe got this thing rolling a little bit. I think back, the one that hops to mind, I think back to that 2018 Ohio State game, Nebraska at that point, I don't remember what the record was. I think maybe 2-6, 2-7, something like that. Goes into Columbus and gives Ohio State like everything it wants. Didn't come away with the win. You mentioned the Spielman losing the ball in the sun, and after the game, Urban Meyer. I now think this was a bit of gamesmanship. I don't know that I did at the time. I'm not going to give myself credit for it anyway. If I did, like, it's effusive about Nebraska. Like, oh, this team's going to be really good. Like, I was really worried about this game. This is going to be difficult. Which is, sure, nice, and especially if you're a Husker fan going through this unexpectedly subpar season in year one after the return of the hallowed sun. But I don't think that made things any easier. But it gave you something to hang your hat on a little bit at the end of that first season. So what if that one flips? It would have made at least, I think, all of the 2019 off-season buzz feel a little bit more legitimate to a degree, but I think a lot of that was just based on Frost's history at UCF plus having Adrian Martinez.
Yeah, 100%. I did think it was funny when you brought up Trevor Kendall Alberts' quote about empirical evidence and saying he was loyal to a Husker. Seems ironic now, right, fellas? Loyalty to a Husker coming out of that man's mouth.
Excellent
that's
point,
neither
Jeffrey.
here nor there. We
excellent point.
Sorry, I got off track there. Obviously, a big reason Frost was so successful at UCF was just because of his offense. Like, I remember watching those games before he came here, and he was on the radar, and just really defense wasn't a factor for them. I think their game plan was, we just need to score more points than the other team and we're going to win. That's just all we need to do. So just score, because I remember those games were high scoring. UCF scored a ton of points, but their opponent scored a ton of points too. And so he had a game plan. It was just, you needed to have an explosive offense to win. And we wanted to see that here at Nebraska, obviously. And I think every once in a while you'd see a glimpse of it, of what could be. It never really panned out. For either of you, is there a specific reason you think that it didn't work out here? Was it the conference just was tougher, obviously, or was there a specific reason you think that that type of offense just didn't pan out in the Big Ten with us?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a great fit for sure. What generated excitement for a year then kind of went stale, I think, as the other coaches in the Big Ten caught up. I mean, I think that the end of that 2018 season, Nebraska was moving the ball. Brandon mentioned the Ohio State game. Nebraska was doing things differently than other teams in the league. Kirk Ferentz said that after the Iowa game that year, like the way that Nebraska played was different and made Iowa uncomfortable. They made some questionable decisions toward the end of that game, but the Big Ten caught up. And in an ironic twist from what we talked about with the Scott Frost presser to start his tenure, it adjusted to Nebraska. And the result was what Nebraska wanted to do was to go fast and score and wear down defenses. And what actually ended up happening was they were playing good Big Ten defenses that sometimes were holding Nebraska to 30-second possessions. And so it would go quickly, and then they would punt. And then the other offense would grind out an 8-minute drive, and you'd look up at the end of the game, and the defense is seeing like 100 snaps, sometimes more than 100 snaps. And it's not a recipe for success. And that's an offense, and that's a style that's either built to play in a shootout like they did in the AAC, or to implement when you have the lead and the other team can't afford to play slow. But too often Nebraska would fall behind even by a touchdown, and they would, boom, their possession was over. The other team would grind it out. And that's just how it went. Nebraska, even in situations, there were multiple times I recall thinking like the smart thing to do in this game situation is to slow things down, kill a little bit of clock. And even then they were so amped up to keep moving. Like they'd snap the ball with 14, 16 seconds left on the play clock in situations where you're trying to milk it. And it was so ingrained in their identity that they couldn't adjust to it. So I think just sort of that style, and then kind of what I mentioned earlier about the defensive side, where they embraced this idea of, we're going to give up points, but we want to get the ball back. I think those two things in combination they're just not a recipe for consistency. Sometimes that comes together, sure. And a lot of times, man, if one thing's not going well, it just doesn't come together.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really well put. I mean, I think there just wasn't a lot of reverence from Frost coming into the Big Ten, which, we talked about earlier. It kind of felt good, if you were a fan base coming out of the Mike Riley era. It was like, let the coach be a little bit arrogant and brash. But the league is tough. Like, I mean, this thing was structured at UCF to, the offense was going to average 40 points a game. The defense was there to supplement that with takeaways, negative plays, and do it that way. And to your point, Jeff, outscore teams essentially. Well, the only team that averages 40 points consistently in the Big Ten is Ohio State, which is basically the only SEC program in the league. And it makes it super interesting, for a USC coming into the Big Ten this year, I think. That's kind of what Nebraska was trying to do. So it was an ill fit to back up what Evan was saying. I also think like a real missing ingredient for Nebraska was the run game outside of 2018 never got going. And those Chip Kelly Oregon teams were built run first, like they moved the ball a lot of ways. UCF was really built around the run. And Frost would talk about this, at various points. But after that first season with Divine Azigbo, like I don't think they got the running backs that they necessarily needed. The O-line kind of never came together. I mean, one of the defining like plays of the Scott Frost era for me is like they get into 3rd and 4, or down inside the 10-yard line, like an important play. And the answer was just QB run. QB run. Like they couldn't hand it off and do it that way. So, you know, that's a little more nuts and boltsy, I think, than the big picture stuff. I mean, I think that the big takeaway is like what they wanted to employ is really hard to employ in the Big Ten, but they didn't get that close because they were never able to run the ball, I think, the way they wanted to.
No.
Right.
O-line had a lot to do with that too.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
yep.
they certainly, as we just kind of alluded to, they've really struggled during the Frost era to play complementary football. And, you know, talking about X's and O's, like it was bizarre to me because occasionally you would see some really, really good play design from Scott Frost. Like clearly he had a good football mind and he could draw up X's and O's really, really well, but it would be like a chunk play here or a chunk play there. It wasn't like a consistent rhythmic offense. We've just kind of covered that. The offense, you know, kind of sputtered, struggled to get going. But, you know, do you think if Frost, do you think there's changes he could have made earlier in his tenure to address some of those things? You know, whether it's the offense getting a little more rhythm, or, you know, I know a couple times he introduced some wrinkles and run a little bit of like traditional triple option, and it was like, oh, here we go. But it was more to be cute, I think, than anything. And you know, the defense is, you know, as far as it really wasn't similar to what he tried to do at UCF with getting a lot of takeaways and tackles for loss, and maybe they just couldn't do it. But any changes you guys think he could have made earlier to kind of fix some things?
Well, I think Brandon's point about the quarterback run fits in here really well because, you know, when you do that, first of all, you're saying you don't trust your running back or your traditional running game. But the other two things that come out of that when you lean on it as heavily as Nebraska did, and they did it as much or more than any other team in the league, is one, you're more prone to turnovers from your quarterback. And we certainly saw that from Adrian Martinez with fumbles and you know, interceptions sort of as a result of that, I think, being hit. But then second to that, injuries. How many times was Adrian Martinez banged up? He had the jaw, he had the knee, obviously, in his first season. And when you're limited as a quarterback, or when you're at your second or your third string guys as consistently as Nebraska was, man, it's hard to execute an offense consistently, especially when your number one guy is physically gifted in a way that your other guys aren't. You're asking, you know, the offense to do different things with a number two or a number three as opposed to Adrian. And so, like, how many games, you know, it happened a lot, you know, multiple games every year where Adrian was out and Nebraska had to figure out a way, or he was in there, but he was limited. And so, like, if there had been more of an emphasis on the traditional run game, if they could have found that running back, heck, if they could have executed screens, swing passes somewhat consistently, where you're taking the burden off of Martinez, if he were healthy for the majority of most of those seasons, you know, I do think there would have been more consistency. That just wasn't the way they wanted to play it. And then by the end, you're in desperation mode and you're just doing whatever you can to survive in a given game. So, you know, I think honestly, when you look ahead to the current Matt Rule era, I think they're getting away from that, which is a positive. Man, you saw a lot of the consequences of leaning so heavily on the run game. That, to me, that's an area they could have changed and seen some results.
Yeah, that's a good one. And this is an area where I think the COVID year does come into play, because broadly, I'm kind of like, yeah, everybody had to deal with that. But with how it fell timeline wise with Frost's tenure, like, you know, that was another disappointing year, but it was COVID, right? So you could just kind of shrug your shoulders and be like, well, who knows? Maybe it's not fair to expect anything. And, like, you know, statistically now, when I'm like looking back at that year, I basically just throw it out for everybody, good, bad, or indifferent. It was just like, yeah, it was bizarre circumstances. So maybe if you don't have that, if you have a regular season, you know, and you don't make a bowl game, maybe you do have to make clear, because as Evan noted earlier, I think by the time you get into 2021, which is when, you know, Nebraska made its most major staff changes under Frost, it already felt like it was too late. And any time, you know, in any coaching tenure, when you're doing that many years in, where you're having to fire guys that you probably don't want to fire. It's basically a sacrifice, right? It's like, well, we're gonna serve up the coordinators, and hopefully that magically fixes this thing for a year, and we can buy ourselves more time. It rarely works, so it's a tough one. I also think Frost was so like set on not only like how he chose to do things, and he's super smart in terms of the football stuff, designing plays, etc. I think it would have been hard to get those changes implemented anyway. I think this was kind of the way they were going to go, and they were willing to go down fighting the way they wanted to do it.
Yeah, to that point about maybe a little stubbornness or hard-headedness or even arrogance, one play or one set of plays that jumps out to me always is the 2019 Colorado game. And I want to say it was definitely the second half. I think it was the fourth quarter. We score a touchdown to go up. I think we're up 7. Kick the ball off. They put together a little bit of a return, and then Cam Taylor-Britt forces a fumble, and we recover it on Colorado's side of the field. And I just remember, I mean, I can still hear the announcer, Nebraska's got the football. And I just remember thinking, there it is. That's the year 2 play. That's the culture play. That's the difference maker that we've been looking for. Like, there we go. We're going to win this game, and off we go. And I could be conflating different parts of the game, but my recollection is the touchdown drive before that was a 75-yard touchdown drive, and it was entirely, we ran the ball the entire time. And at that point, I think we're up 7. We just got the ball back on the turnover. We're on the right side of the field. And I don't know, there's 6 or 7 minutes left in the game, which ended up feeling like an eternity the way that game ended. First play, Martinez in the shotgun, and he chucks it like 40 yards for an incompletion. And I don't remember, like, I think, maybe he was throwing it away, whatever it was. But I think we quickly went 3 and out and had to give the ball right back. And I just remember thinking, like, why would passing the ball, and Scott Frost has forgotten more about football than I'll ever know, and X's and O's and play calling and all that stuff. But I just remember thinking, like, what do we do? Like, we just run the ball there. At worst case scenario, if you're going to have to give it back, take 2 or 3 minutes off the clock at least. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, sorry, didn't mean to go down that rabbit hole. One other, a couple other areas I wanted to explore with you guys. A friend of the program, Michael Severe, gave an interview shortly after Frost was fired. And, Severe kind of gave multiple reasons for why he was fired, and that had nothing to do with wins and losses. He mentioned the head coach being late for practice every day. He mentioned Frost not making recruiting calls. He said there were assistant coaches going to the athletic director to complain about how things were being run. Did either of you guys get a sense as you were covering the team that there were problems behind the scenes? That's bordering on or crossing the line into dysfunction, really. Did you guys get a sense of any of that?
Some. I mean, first of all, Scott Frost is not, he didn't love the media. So I've had more off the record talks with Matt Rule in a few months than I had with Scott Frost in 5 years. So like, that part of that's just his personality. But yeah, I mean, I think you got the sense something odd was going on in his personal life with his wife. Like, there was he made a point of walking off the field with her one time, almost as if in response to certain rumors that were going on. I think you look at some of the recruiting results late in his tenure, and certainly the numbers fell off, and the quality of prospect that they got was maybe different than it was early on in his career or his time at Nebraska, just because the vision hadn't started manifesting on the field. And so it was tailing off in that way as well. I'll always remember his last in-state tour. I think it must have been before the 22 season. It was out in Kearney, and there were like 200 people there. And, not a crowd that you're looking for with the head coach of Nebraska football there. And he made some jokes, and some of them were funny. And he made a reference to Luke McCaffrey transferring. They got back to Christian McCaffrey, who put him on blast on Twitter at the time. And like, it felt like he never knew how to strike the right tone. with different things, or how to handle things, or whether to be tough, or to approach it with a little bit of touch, or whatever it might be. So I think all those things were maybe little red flags, but I can't confirm a lot of what Michael said about recruiting calls or being late to practice. I don't know how true some of that stuff is, but I mean, certainly it would line up with some of the results that they saw. I mean, by the 22 season, it really did feel like Scott Frost was checked out. You talk about that onside kick call against Northwestern. I mean, if you recall, for that game, he had given up his play calling duties at that point, and it almost just felt like, man, this is a guy who is trying to make a difference. He just wants to make an impact on the game, because he's not calling the plays. He's clearly unhappy about that. Garrett Nelson at the time was in Big Ten Media Days that year, said, yeah, we're trying to make coach feel better about it. And there was you could kind of sense there was some dysfunction going on there. How deep it went, maybe, I don't know that we'll ever fully know, but certainly they were symptoms of something bigger going on.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not around the program on a daily basis the way Evan and a lot of other people are. When I would say, there was a kind of a general sense of, shouldn't this be a little more organized? Or at least that was my sense. And, it didn't, a lot of the things that I think when we think of what made Nebraska really strong under Tom Osborne, kind of an intense focus on detail. I would say that this tenure felt the opposite of detail oriented to me. And I think you gotta be, most places, but specifically out of Nebraska. And I think with Matt Rule, it's the thing he's hit on so far. It's super early in his tenure too. But he seems to be about that piece of it. We're going to be good at this for the sake of being good at it. We're not going to be good at this so we can snap a 6-game losing streak in 1-score games, because that's a very different psychological thing. So you heard a lot of stuff about Frost. It's what do you do with it? And, I think we'll probably get into this a little bit more. I know for us, speaking of the outlet I was at the time, you'd heard things, you'd try to track them down. If you had something you could report, you'd report it. But it was irresponsible if you didn't have something, buttoned up to report it. I think the difference becomes, all over the country when coaches leave, well, then the responsibility changes a little bit for some people, in that, maybe you're willing to talk a little bit more freely at that point. That's probably the difference between because there's this genre of journalism where it's it's the, well, now you tell us story, right? Where was this 6 months ago? And I mean, I think that's where it comes from for me, at least the way I tried to do it, in terms of working with our staff, is we got to get this stuff buttoned up. And I mean, I have the utmost respect for what Evan and the team at the World Herald do, and I'm sure they were in a pretty similar boat.
I love that explanation, Evan, by the way, because I remember that was a huge concern for a lot of people that would say, well, why didn't the media report this beforehand? Why is this just coming out now after he's gone? So I love that you explained that. That's great, especially for our listeners. I think they'll find that really, really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's a slippery slope on what you're going to report on and what you're not, especially if you don't have concrete evidence. But that, like you guys said, there's maybe some signs of dysfunction or just lack of organization. But when Trev Alberts came in as athletic director, he kind of seemed to indicate something similar, that there was a lot that needed to be cleaned up in the athletic department. When he had said he was meeting with Frost after every game, and it certainly seemed to suggest there were some accountability measures that maybe were needed, or Trevor Kendall Alberts thought were needed. Looking back, we kind of talked about Bill Moose, and maybe he was kind of just a slick talking guy from Montana who was brought in to land Scott Frost and Fred Hoiberg, but other than that, maybe he's just a good deal maker. Maybe Moose was a good figurehead, but maybe not the best administrator, I guess is the way to say it. Do you guys think there's anything Bill Moose could have done or should have, been doing to kind of help Frost succeed, or maybe kind of manage, the job that is being the coach of, a program like Nebraska?
Well, I think he could have been more hands-on. I mean, that's probably the biggest critique from Bill Moose's time was, I mean, often he wasn't even in the state. He was back on his ranch in Washington State, I believe it's in. And sometimes, like, if he were the AD for, say, Matt Rule, that's probably a little more okay. Scott Frost had been a first-time head coach at an AAC program who was coming home dealing with a much different set of circumstances and expectations. And Moose was a guy who had been at Oregon and seen some pretty high-level football. I think he could have been maybe more of a mentor or sounding board for Scott Frost as he sort of navigated, especially those first couple of years as he was going along. But like, you think of some of the things that Bill Moose would say, I would say few of them were helpful to what they were trying to do at the time. I mean, I think of the 2019 Big Ten Media Days when he's in the basement of a Chicago ballroom saying, hey, 6-6, that's what I'm looking for. And that was a year where they were top 25. And so it kind of felt like, okay, what are the expectations here? Because you're hearing one thing on one side, you're hearing another thing from Bill Moose. You had the whole comment about early on about Ohio State and Michigan are running a little scared because Nebraska's on the rise. And it was just like, you don't need that stuff. And Bill Moose was a promoter, and he was very confident, I think, in Scott Frost. He called him the pick of the litter at his introductory presser, right? So, like, very folksy, very kind of everyman sort of personality. And I just don't know that it often helped Nebraska's cause what he was doing. So I would say, yeah, he could have been a little bit more, hands-on or served as more of a mentor as Frost was breaking in at a major college football program.
That reminds me, I think it was the COVID year where Moose basically said publicly he had tried to, because they were having to redo the schedule to accommodate, no non-conference games, COVID season, all that stuff. And so Moose basically indicated that he had tried to influence the scheduling process to give Nebraska easier games up front, and that he wasn't very successful at that. So one, like, you're basically indicating that you don't think your team's ready to play the good teams. And two, you're showing your hand as being ineffective. I just remember thinking, like, why did you say any of this? This is not helpful at all. Like, I'm embarrassed for you, Bill.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with where Evan was at on that. Like, I don't want to pretend like I knew a lot about Frost's relationship with Danny White, the AD at UCF, who's now at Tennessee, doing a good job at Tennessee for the most part. But it seemed like that, it was pretty cordial at worst, and maybe it was even closer than I'm giving it credit for, but. Frost was still a young coach at the point that he took the Nebraska job, and in some ways, in retrospect, now and that you could copy paste from UCF, but like, it went exactly to plan over 2 seasons. There, you go take an 0-12 team, go to 6-6, and then go undefeated in your second season, and then all of a sudden you're back at your alma mater. The last thing Frost needed at that point, I think, was an AD who was like, well, glad you're here. Got you here, buddy. Let's go win a trophy. I can give you about 36 months to do that. Like, I think if it's tough, because I think Frost probably needed somebody who could be a little bit more of a sounding board, at least. That said, I don't think he was ever going to be the guy who, like, sought out that kind of mentor type relationship. I mean, I think back to the offseason where Frost got dinged for their improper use of a special teams analyst, and that Trev Alberts press conference where Trev was like, it was like dad taking son to the neighbors across the street to apologize for breaking the window. So, and I think that was a tough part too of those. You mentioned the weekly meetings. Like, that wasn't Frost's idea.
Right.
So, you know,
Brutal.
it's tough. You know, Frost had a lot of confidence in his abilities, and it justified, you know, to the point that it got him the Nebraska job. So it was going to be a tough one, but you know, I don't know if that perfect AD is out there to navigate that what those waters were over those
Right.
5 seasons.
I'm trying to rack my brain there and remember that press conference after that special teams debacle. Was Trevor standing up there with him, if I remember correctly?
Yes.
Mhm.
God, it was like that. That's a great comparison. Sticking with Bill Moose for just a second, and Evan, you mentioned it, like his folksy charm was one thing people really liked about him. He seemed to be pretty popular with Husker Nation, with the fan base. I know a few of our friends would catch him at a game, even a road game, and take pictures with him. Seemed to be pretty well liked. And I mean, Brandon, you said it earlier on that his job was to land Scott Frost, and he did that, and that made him very popular with the fan base. Um, but he, abruptly retired before the 2021 season, and it was announced on June 25th, and then it was effective 5 days later. So since things moved so quickly with Moose, do you think he was pushed out? And if he was pushed out, was it directly related to football, or do you guys have any insight, both of you, in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, it came together pretty quickly there toward the end. And no, I don't think he wanted to leave at that time. He had been on the record fairly recently before his departure that he would like to stay on, though he did not like the direction that college athletics was going at that time with the portal and NIL really just starting to come into being. So maybe, in hindsight for him, he is happy that he hung it up. But uh, there were talks, of course, around that time about uh, his use of alcohol. We reported a follow-up on that from him about what that was like, and it seemed like it was a little bit overblown, perhaps. Certain budgetary things within the department maybe weren't as buttoned up as Nebraska regents wanted them to be with various contracts, just some of the way that they operated financially. I think a lot of that came into it. And when you see a guy get the kind of golden parachute financial package that he got, that tells you that they were ready for him to go away and that they were probably not ready for him to talk too much about it. So at that point, I think they were ready for what was next. They felt like I don't know that they had Trev Alberts in mind at that time, but they were ready for a different leadership group, certainly because of, I think probably in part because of what we talked about with Moose as a mentor to some of the young coaches that were at Nebraska at that time. But no, I don't think he wanted to leave, but a lot of other people were ready to turn the page on to what was next.
Yeah, and opposed to some of the other athletic departures we've talked about in this series, I don't think it had much to do with football in this case. Like, it would be hard to make that case because I think Moose would be like, "Well, I got the guy you wanted. Everybody knew we had to get right." And beyond that, like, I don't know how much, like, how intimately involved he was with like football. Like, he signed off on things, sure, and he was sort of a spokesperson for it. You talk to the AD about football because it's super important. But beyond that, like, this wasn't a case of, I think it wasn't Steve Peterson where it's like, well, you made your change and it was wrong, so now somebody's got to pay for that. That wasn't the case with Moose.
We're all in the wrong line of work, guys. I mean, there's a lot of people getting fired for failing and getting paid millions of dollars to do it. So I'm still hoping to find that job before my career is over. I want to go back real quick, guys, just to the discussion about the Severe interview for a minute. And I also remember Damon Benning saying something, after Frost was fired, something along the lines of, we the fans couldn't handle knowing what he knows. And I feel like at this point, listening to podcasts or reading, it's almost commonplace to hear references to sort of the disorganization or the dysfunction of the Frost era. And I want to make clear to both of you guys and to all of our listeners, like, the common fans are huge fans of the Nebraska sports media. I don't think Nebraska fans understand how lucky they have it sometimes, that we have so many different outlets covering the Huskers. There's always the joke, not joke, but the conversation about there's 40 plus media members at every football practice. And for all of us common fans who love to feed the addiction, there's so many, such a diverse group of publications and outlets out there. But when you think about it, the head football coach is the state's highest paid employee. And so, and the other thing is, I want to be clear, like there were, I think Evan, you referenced some of the rumors that were out there. In my personal opinion, I don't think it's on the World Herald to go chase down rumors about Frost or anybody else's personal life. I just think that's nobody's business. Is not the job of the media. But if the guy's late to practice, if the guy's not doing his job, I guess the way I would put it is this, Brandon, as you said, you tried to chase certain things down. You guys did. If somebody's got that verified information, how much do fans what do fans have a right to know? How much do fans deserve to know? I don't know if deserve is the right word, but how much do fans have a right to know about some of that stuff that's out there, especially when it involves the state's highest paid public employee?
I think that debate, I've thought about that before. It kind of reminds me of the discussion around Bill Clinton in the late 90s with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, because the economy was booming, things were going well, but you had this thing on the side that people were all up in arms about. And I remember just the debate on the one hand that said, hey, if things are going well, man, whatever he's doing, it's not our business. And on the other side, it was people saying, well, he's the most powerful man in the country. He needs to be holding himself to some standard. And I kind of feel like there's some of that in this debate with Scott Frost too, where at some point, if Nebraska continues to fail, and they still haven't been back to a bowl game since 2016, you want to know why that is. And sometimes that's bad luck, sometimes that's recruiting, and maybe in this case there was also an element of just things in his personal life that were affecting job performance, kind of some of the things that you're alluding to. So yeah, I think when you reach that point, then yeah, those things become fair game. And it's not easy to report, because you still have to have people willing to talk about it. And you still have to do your due diligence and make sure you're not feeding innuendo and all the rest. Certainly we do at the World Herald, and I know Brandon did, but if you're, say, at a message board, you could put different things out there, especially as a fan. And that's where a lot of that stuff I know is fueled from. I've heard that there were former players that maybe weren't always big fans of Scott Frost that would put some of those rumors out there too, and just kind of let them take on life of their own. So yeah, I think it has to be part of the discussion. Again, how much it can be because of just what we know. It kind of is what it is. And the other thing that I would say too is I think part of the conversation of Scott Frost is complicated because he's the only Nebraska coach who was fired in the middle of the season. And so when Bill Callahan was fired, or Bo Pelini was fired, or whomever, you had this period to sort of process what just happened and think it through. Why did it not work? With Scott Frost, you still had 2/3 of a season to go. And by the time that was over, hey, Matt Rule on Iowa Day, it becomes out that he's going to be the next coach. And so there was never any time. And I don't think people maybe wanted time to process about why it didn't work out. So it's a very nuanced, I think, specific discussion to what just happened here. And I don't know that there's ever going to be an answer that's going to satisfy fans fully. I think that's the nature of it.
Yeah. I mean, I think about some of the specific, the interview you mentioned with Michael Severe, and let's call it the job performance piece of it, and leave the other stuff to the side. If there were people who were to were more willing to corroborate some of those pieces of it, I guess now, could you put out a story now of hey, here's some of the stuff that was going on? There would be a portion of people who would read it. I would be interested in it if somebody had it, had the story and felt they had it nailed down. But I think if you put that out there, a lot of the response you're going to get is like, so what? Like, that was 3, 4, 5 years ago. We're worried about 2024 now, which is a piece of it too. And, you know, it can be a challenge, I think, to remain like outside of that. And in some degree, I think that's kind of our job as journalists, is to remain outside of that. But you'll often see it kind of both ways too, with just like post-game press conferences. Like, some people will tell you like, nobody's asking tough questions. What's going on here? Why doesn't anybody have any teeth? Well, I think back to the Bo Pelini area, where like a lot of people felt it was really evenly divided, of like people who felt like, oh, Bo's not being treated fairly. So it's kind of it's tough to navigate sometimes, to know like where to fall in that. And I think ultimately, you try to determine what's true in any situation. And I think if you felt like you determined what's true, and it's in the public interest, you put it out there. I mean, it's fairly kind of basic journalism stuff. At least that's how I've always tried to keep our approach, or my approach, personally, when I've had decisions like that to make.
Yeah, I appreciate both your guys' candor on this. I think this is a
Yeah.
really interesting discussion.
Mhm.
I think, some of this gets at the whole, like, part of what we're doing with the Reckoning episode. And I think, like, the fans, we've been through so much drama in the post Osborne era, and, right up to and including Trevor Kendall Alberts leaving, not that long ago. Right. And like, some dysfunction over the years, poor leadership over the years, poor decision making, and with football, a lot of losing. Evan, to your point, I think if Frost was going 10-2, 11-1, and winning conference titles, nobody cares if he's showing up late to practice, right? Or whatever the case might be. I think from the fan perspective, and not all of this, and most of this is not the media's sort of responsibility at all, but I think fans feel like they were repeatedly asked to show up. They're asked for donations. They're asked to buy tickets. We continue to show up, right? I mean, we continue to fill the stadium after 7 consecutive losing seasons. Now we're getting asked to contribute to NIL efforts as well. And, I think Husker fans are the best fan base in the world. I'll fight I'll fight to my grave with anybody. And I think some of this is just fans. And then something happens like the Trev Alberts thing blindsides the whole Nebraska community, and fans are like, wait a second, what's going on here? So people always want more to the story. I think winning fixes a lot of this, and hopefully we're well on our way to that. All right, gentlemen, let's pivot here. We've got the final verdict of the common fans. Back to the question at hand. How in the world did Scott Frost not work at Nebraska? Evan, do you want to start?
Sure. I don't think there's any one reason. I think we touched on a lot of it. I think some of it was about the transition period that he was in. He was the head coach when the transfer portal came into being, when NIL came into being. He had to adjust to that. Again, everybody did. So that's, I think, one piece of it. I think the baggage piece is a real thing. I mean, you think back to when he came to Lincoln, and before he went up and talked to the media on the 3rd floor at Memorial Stadium, he spoke with multiple hundred former players in the weight room. And so I think that immediately set the tone that, like, yeah, these are the guys that he's working for, not the fans, certainly not the media. Like, it's the former players that really rallied behind him and wanted him. So I think that's part of it. I think the certainly the scheme was not a great fit for the Big Ten. And maybe, as much as anything, and I think we're learning this more now with the Matt Rule era, is in modern college football, like the kind of head coach you want is someone who's got a steady culture and a steady identity. And what Scott Frost's best asset was, I think, was as a play caller. I mean, he was an outstanding offensive coordinator at Oregon and took that to UCF. And when you become the head coach at Nebraska, your best quality sort of gets lost in the noise of all the other things you have to do as a head coach. So I think in that way, it wasn't a great fit. They never really established an identity. I mean, we talked about kind of what they wanted to do on offense and defense, but it manifested. You couldn't see that in the statistics. You certainly couldn't see that in the game results. So I think all of that sort of came together, and he didn't have a ton of administrative support too, as we mentioned with Bill Moose. So I think it's such a frustrating, it's probably not a satisfying answer to a lot of people, because I don't think you can say it was one single thing. But I think all those circumstances coming together, sort of snowballed into this really unsatisfying era where there was so much potential, so much optimism, and very rarely was any of it realized.
Well put.
Yeah, I completely agree that there's so much that's still here and still worth sifting through. I think in an effort to try, like, if you force me, like, you got like 2 sentences, what's it going to be? I go back to kind of where we started with that, open press conference, and this is an oversimplification, but like, kind of came down to humility to me. And I think this ties in a couple of ways, of like, not just like how they came in, but like, in some ways the 1-score loss thing kind of hurt them. Well, we obviously know that they lost the games, but I think hurt Frost in that, like, you really did seem that close. So, do you need wholesale changes? It would have taken, a good amount of humility to be like, yep, I see where this is going and it's not working. So we're going to need to change our thinking a little bit, because he is a brilliant play caller. And it was such a strange confluence of eras, some of which Evan mentioned, but like, we look at it now, I think, as Evan was kind of alluding to, you're kind of looking at the era of the CEO coach, which you have to be when you figure in like NIL into this piece of it now. I think Frost would have had a hard time like being that guy. That doesn't mean he couldn't have become that person. But I almost wonder if like his trajectory, it almost feels like the trajectory of like the G5 up and comer, moving up to a Nebraska, which for a long time was just like, that's how it worked. That's how you got from point A to point B. That almost feels dead. You look at a guy like Sean Lewis, leaves a MAC job to become the head coach or come offensive coordinator of Colorado, and now he's back at San Diego State. Jason Candle's been at Toledo. Nobody's tried to hire him away. I wonder if as we move to more of a Power 2 era, if that piece of things isn't going away. And if so, then Frost was, probably in the last batch of guys who was in that group where it made total sense. Where it's like, yep, he went to UCF, did great. I mean, Urban Meyer was only at Utah, which was, then still in the Mountain West for 2 years before he got the Florida job. So it's there's just so much in there, and so much change just in the time that Frost was at Nebraska, and it's ongoing right now.
Do you guys think?
Go
ahead.
Can I just add real quick? I want to add real quick on Brandon's point about humility, because you know what the opposite end of that spectrum example is at Nebraska is Fred Hoiberg, who also was a young coach who came to Nebraska, and he'd been at the Bulls, but like, who had a vision for what he wanted to do, offense. And he did adjust, and they make the tournament, and he's still there, right? Like, I think that's really fascinating, because those two coaches came on at the same time, roughly. They had very similar offense-based identities. One of them stuck with what he had all the way through. The other guy adjusted, and look at how the results are. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Great point.
Yeah, that's a great call out, Evan. I'm curious what the group thinks about this. The transition year, like you said, Brandon, almost anything could happen in a transition year. We all have to suffer through them. The transition year is 2018. They go 4-8. Tons of hype going into 2019. You could make the argument they should have been at worst 7-5. They blow a 17-0 halftime lead against Colorado. That Purdue game, I still think about that Purdue game that they absolutely should have won as well. And then they also had, what were they up, 21-3 on Indiana or something like that? 14, maybe it was 14-3. And then 21-10 or something like that. But they lost that game to Indiana. I feel like there was, the Iowa game was close, as Frost always played Iowa close. It felt like they could have had, 8 or 9 wins that season. And there was so much hype going into that season. Do you feel like when it didn't work in 2019, they didn't even get to a bowl game? And then of course, 2020 was the COVID season. They go 3-5. Somewhere in there, maybe post 2019 or post 2020, do you think like My recollection is Frost was so confident that they had the blueprint that it was going to take off in year 2. And do you think when it didn't, and also, combined with the fact that homegrown Nebraska boy from Wood River, quarterback of the last national championship team, it was so important to him. And when it didn't take off like he thought it was going, like it should, did it start to like cave in on him? Did it become too much? Like, and maybe that's what led to some of the issues about being late to practice or not calling recruits. Maybe that happened later in the tenure when things felt like they were crumbling. I don't know. What do you guys think about that?
I think you can feel that pressure. I mean, I think about the talks leading up to the 2020 season where Nebraska was pushing for football, and the messaging from Nebraska was different from, say, Ohio State, in that I think at Nebraska, when you're the head coach, it's more than just the football. Like, you feel there's almost like a moral responsibility to the community. Like Nebraska, and Scott Frost said it, like they wanted to play for the players, but they also wanted to play for the community and for the restaurants and the shops that rely on those game days to generate revenue. So I feel like there's an extra weight maybe that comes with that. And I would say too, just where he was in life, and I think most of you guys can relate as well, as fathers of young kids. Like he had young kids, like toddler, I think a couple, toddler age, young children. And so like you're feeling that pull as well. And so I think there were a lot of things kind of weighing on you. And I think you saw some of the discontent start to come out. Certainly the Maurice Washington situation, we didn't even talk about that, but like that was a real weight, a real drain on the program as he was going through his legal issues. He was a late Frost signee that first year. They wanted to keep him around. Obviously, he was a dynamic talent who had a lot of issues off the field, but I think all that stuff, and then just, again, being at Nebraska, feeling like you're accountable to a lot of former players who wanted access, who wanted to be back, who wanted you to be that bridge to modern Nebraska football. I do think a lot of that stuff can weigh him down. I think he had a quote after his third year or so where he's like, man, this is making me old, trying to get that level of discipline that they want. And so when it doesn't happen, it's almost like here's another presidential reference. Like when you see a guy come into office versus when you see him go out, and how much he ages in 4 years. Like, right. I feel like that was Scott Frost. We kind of saw that in real time.
Yeah.
Matt, Jeff, Brandon, any final thoughts on that?
I mean, I do.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Brandon.
I mean, I think it was part of the reason Nebraska was able to get Frost is part of the reason it was also kind of bound to get heavy quickly if things didn't kind of go their way. It's not just that he was a former Husker. Like he's a little bit unique in my mind in that, well, his mom's role at the university is his father was also a former Husker, but then he's from Wood River, and and there were all these anecdotes about how he and Ryan Held would do Sporkle quizzes about towns in Nebraska, and they would like test each other about trying to name the county seat or name all 93 counties. Like, I mean, he wasn't just a Husker, like he was uniquely kind of, I think, tied to the state. And that came through some of these times, because I mean, so many of these press conferences, post-game press conferences, ended up being the same because the games felt so much the same. And what do you say? And he would say things like, I'm gonna get this right, for Nebraska, like I'm the guy. And sure, those are the sorts of things you say, but it always carried at least a little bit of extra weight for me. So I do think when you just could never quite crest the hill, the downside to that was maybe uniquely heavy for this particular coach, given his background, essentially.
Yeah.
That's a great point, Jeff.
Yeah, my only thought, if you want a serious answer, like I think a lot of it had to do with the late to practice, off the field stuff. Just simply, if you're hired to be a leader of men, and that's what a head coach is, I feel it's just really hard to command respect when you're not leading by example. And it says a lot if you're not showing up to things on time or doing things the right way. if you're clearly not showing that you care as much, why are your if he's not caring, why should I type of mentality, just like with any other job. So that certainly didn't help his case. I think that's a big reason why things didn't work out. Plus, I mean, Brandon, you said it earlier with maybe Moose should have been, however you want to word it, checked on him a little bit more, just kind of kept him in line a little bit, or, managed him almost. Maybe things would have worked out better. But if you're looking for a delusional excuse, the college football industrial complex definitely engineered a lightning storm to get that Akron game canceled.
Yeah.
And we were downhill from there. So,
gosh, how do we not put this on the college football industrial complex?
I know, I've been
That's
waiting for
exactly
a time to bring
right, Jeff. That is spot on. That is, Matteo, let me respond to something Jeff said real quick. You make a good point, Jeff. And we'll probably, until somebody writes the book, Brandon, but we'll probably never know the extent of those issues or what those issues were. But I do remember thinking, like, giving him the benefit of the doubt, probably well into year 4, and finally thinking to myself, okay, when you have this many close losses, when you have this many, if just one more guy makes a play, maybe we win that game. That ultimately is a culture issue. It's a discipline issue. It's a leader. It's an issue at the top, right? And maybe it's as simple as, worst case, maybe he's missing practice all the time. Maybe it's not that complicated. Maybe he just wasn't that detail oriented. I don't know. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle, right? Again, we'll probably never know until Evan and Brandon partner and write the book together. But I do think, like, there was clear, to your point about detail, Brandon, that was just missing, right? And I think, one of the anecdotes I've heard is, again, he gets full credit for what he did at UCF, but one of the things I've heard is that team had a lot of talent. Well, who's the guy before Frost? O'Leary. George O'Leary kind of lost the locker room and was kind of a drill sergeant type of coach. And so Frost's approach of a lighter touch, love on the players, which he talked about at Nebraska too, maybe a little bit less disciplined, kind of was the spark that UCF needed, but maybe that wasn't what Nebraska needed in the time he was there. Matteo, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this whole series is about, what happened and what ifs, right? The Frost era, like you named him off earlier, TJ, the list of what ifs is so long that when I have a list that long, well, if this would happen in that game, this would happen in that game, you have multiple times it's happening in multiple seasons, it's just not working. And like we've talked about, there's multiple reasons why it probably didn't work. But I just find it so interesting that it felt like this era to me felt more like death by 1,000 paper cuts than like all these other eras kind of felt like, okay, that there was one or two turning points there where, okay, that was the nail in the coffin, or that was, for the most part. This one felt like several seasons of the same thing over and over, Groundhog Day. And I think the blinders were on for a lot of us because we wanted it to work so bad. And I think that way this one felt a little bit different to me than, the other coaches that we've had over the last 20 some years. But I think Scott Frost is a really good football coach. But I don't think he was ready for, and I hate this term, but he's ready. I don't think he's ready for the fishbowl of being the head coach at Nebraska, being the most powerful man in the state. I just don't think he was ready for that responsibility. And like you said, TJ, maybe there was a point where he realized that, hey, what I want to do isn't working, and maybe he just shut down a little bit. We don't know, and we won't know. But I just find it so absolutely bizarre. I don't think there was ever a moment where I'm like, well, we should have let him finish out that 5th season. Like it was, I mean, in a way, I kind of feel like, yeah, maybe Trevor Kendall Alberts didn't have to fire him so early and could have paid him $7.5 million less. But, I think that it happened the way it had to happen. So yeah. I don't think it would have worked.
Can I put one other what if out there too?
Hey guys, we can keep going. We go for hours. Let's do it.
I've always wondered about this. If they had fired Scott Frost after the 21 season, how differently would fans view that era? Because
if you think back at that time, there still was a sizable chunk of the fan base that said,
Yeah.
most of these losses were by one score. Like, it's not like they were getting blown out. They were competitive, and that was always the big thing, under previous coaches was, man, you couldn't win the big games. You got blown out by equal or better programs. That was not the case with Nebraska at that time. So in some ways, giving him the start to that 22 season and letting things completely go off the rails galvanized the fan base, I think, into this consensus that, okay, it is time to move on. But I just wonder, man, how split would fans have been had they made the move after 21? In hindsight, they could have hired Kalen DeBoer at that time, which would have been really interesting. But I don't know what you guys think about that. But I think just that doomed fifth season brought a lot of closure and resolution that maybe is beneficial now as they're moving forward under Matt Rule.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the way. I think that's the way it had to happen. Because just because of what you just said, there was a good sizable chunk of the fan base. I would say at least 50% would be my estimate, but that didn't want him to go and said, he's our guy, give him a little more time. But I think that those first three games that season, I think put the nail in the coffin.
I would say, although he deserves no credit for anything, and he is now spending his days with the Texas A&M male yell squad, that Trevor Kendall Alberts handled that situation perfectly.
Yeah.
Yeah, completely uniquely, which I think speaks to like just what a kind of unicorn situation the whole Scott Frost era was. Unless there's a school that just like can't afford the buyout, like find me another place with the resources of Nebraska that lets a coach finish the previous season 0-6. I mean, because they were 3-3 in that 3-9 season, and lost 6 straight games.
Yeah.
And to your point, I agree with you. Even after losing 6 straight, I think it was probably pretty 50-50 of like, should he get another year? It's just, it's strange. Hopefully we all get to keep following this for a long time, but I don't know that we'll see another one like the 5 years we had with the Scott Frost era.
No.
Well, guys, I gotta say, I really didn't know how to feel about going into this episode, because it was like reopening like recent wounds, and like going back on the recent past, and
the stitches
pain
had healed, and now they're opened up again.
Right, exactly. But I don't know. I feel this has been cathartic. Like, I feel like
closure, TJ.
Closure. We part of what we said about maybe the reason for doing the Reckoning series is to do our small part, the common fans part, to exercise whatever demons have possessed the Nebraska football program and help Husker Nation move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. And so perhaps we've taken a step in that direction tonight, gentlemen. This has been a thoroughly enjoyable conversation. We're going to give Evan the last word. Brandon, do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think we've kind of talked through it all. I've got one. Just when I thought that I'd gone through all of the Scott Frost scare stats possible, they didn't beat an FBS team that finished with a winning record after 2018. And the two that they beat then were 7-5.
Michigan State was one,
and Minnesota was the other one.
In Minnesota,
the
first season. Wow,
that's rough.
Yeah.
Evan, any final thoughts?
What an uplifting note.
Yeah,
such a beautiful, beautiful segue.
Let's pull you back down in the mud, TJ.
No, I mean, it's I agree. Like, it's a chance to process when you move on so quickly. And I know this is a Scott Frost segment, but I do think reflecting on it does give me increased appreciation for what Matt Rule's doing. Just the thoroughness of things, the culture piece. This is the opposite of Wan'Dale Robinson leaving because they're handing him the ball as a running back when he wants to be the receiver, right? This is the opposite of just some of the discontent individually within the team, within the fan base. Certainly Scott Frost was not one for the spotlight. That was not something that he liked. He talked about the fishbowl. I like to say that Matt Rule has the gills to be in the fishbowl. I don't know that Scott Frost did. So I think if nothing else, like thinking back on where Nebraska has been gives me more optimism and maybe a positive outlook for where it's going to be, because it does look like it's being built the right way with attention specifically to winning within the Big Ten, building a roster in the modern era, all of that sort of things. I think there are a lot of lessons that can be taken from the Frost era that we're starting to see maybe be learned at Nebraska after all these years into 2024.
That's the way we end it, Evan. I love that. All right, Common fans, that concludes our examination of the post-Osborne era coaching tenures. But you're not done with the Reckoning series, because we are going to look forward to the promise of Matt Rule. There will be more Reckoning episodes, 1 or 2 more before it's all said and done. So hope you enjoyed this thoroughly engaging conversation, Husker Nation. We will be back at you soon. Until next time, as always, GBR for life.